Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
One of those figures who people are still in 100 years talking about as a truly historic figure. I mean, Boris Johnson is a weather maker.
I'm Christopher Hope, Chief Political Correspondent at The Telegraph, and this is Chopper's Politics. And this week's episode was planned almost entirely from the queue of my local barbers, as I joined thousands of people across the country desperate to have their lockdown locks cut for the first time in months. For me, it was a 4-month wait, and my unruly locks were sheared nobly by Vince, who I heavily tipped. Frankly, if I hadn't paid that money and got the haircut, I'm not sure my marriage would have survived. Yes, that's right. This week we had queues outside shops and, of course, chilly people in coats outside pubs as the government began to call time, finally, on some pandemic restrictions. And we'll be talking about how the hospitality industry is wanting more reassurance this week now that some normal service has been resumed with Kate Nicholls from the industry trade body UK Hospitality later in this show. Plus, how do you feel about the possibility of vaccine passports before you can get a pint? We'll be discussing the practicalities of that, amongst other subjects, with Tory MP Tobias Ellwood. But first, the job of being Prime Minister is undoubtedly hard, and the job of being a former one is arguably even harder, if David Cameron's week is anything to go by. The former Prime Minister tried to explain his actions after it came out that he had sent private texts attempting to lobby the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak. Now, one man well versed in the ups and downs of life in Number 10 is Sir Anthony Seldon, who's written countless biographies of First Lords of the Treasury. His latest book, The Impossible Office, The History of the British Prime Minister, looks at whether the job is, well, impossible, and how it can be improved, making it a bit more possible, perhaps. So I thought, given a former PM was taking up so many column inches this week, now is a good time to give him a call. Anthony Seldon, welcome to Chopper's Politics. Great to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
Now, your book out this month called The Impossible Office, The History of the British Prime Minister. I'm going to ask, are you doing a follow-up book called The Impossible Ex-Office? Because it's so difficult, it seems, for Prime Ministers, as they're retiring younger, to find something meaningful to do outside of Number 10. Witness the David Cameron situation with Greensill this week and the inquiry launched by Boris Johnson into his predecessor's activities.
The job is pretty difficult to make it work well, which is why in the last 70 years since Clement Attlee, the great Labour leader, stood down, there's only been one really iconic, historic, landmark Prime Minister, namely Margaret Thatcher, and many who have disappointed expectations. But, you know, post-premiership, life after 10, even more difficult, particularly because they're younger. You know, these people don't just want to sit on their hands. They want to do things when they come out. And yet, whichever way they turn, it seems that they're going to get blasted and castigated, which is why we need a better framework. But, you know, call me old-fashioned. I think that it is a service to have been Prime Minister, and you have to give back to the country. And I think you have a duty to ensure that you do something that is going to benefit people in a not dissimilar way to the monarchy.
I mean, we are basically funding, I think it's about £100,000 a year that we as taxpayers put up every year to pay for an office for former Prime Ministers. What's your advice for David Cameron?
Well, I think he has enormous good, but I don't think he's judged this well. He can become a national treasure in a way that when he's not irritating people who disagree with him on Brexit, John Major has become a national treasure, and Margaret Thatcher did. He can do that, but he has to find his niche, something that truly he believes in, which people can respect and admire and think is appropriate. And they very much don't think it's appropriate. And the first Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, was 10,000 times worse in office and out of office than anything that any former Prime Minister has done in recent times. But times were different then, and he has to find something that gains respect and trust.
It's difficult, isn't it? Your book, The Impossible Office, does start with a very interesting and amusing conversation between the first Prime Minister, Robert Walpole, as you say, and Boris Johnson, number 55. You were struck, weren't you, by the similarities, the fact that they both went to Eton, for example, and had issues with America.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. So they didn't just go to Eton together, they slept in the same room, studied in the same areas, then went on to the same university. They're both incredible chancellors. The Brexit of the day, the South Sea bubble, was responsible for Walpole becoming Prime Minister in 1721, and Brexit, similar in many ways, made Johnson Prime Minister. They both nearly died in their first term in office. They both have partners who are 25 years younger than them in age. I mean, the similarities just they're both bon viveurs. They're both bigger, larger than life figures who dominate those around them and have a much stronger public voice. So fascinating similarities. So they're having dinner together, and Boris is realizing to his chagrin that actually Walpole, despite everything that Boris Johnson had been taught, and everyone's taught that the Prime Minister's become steadily more powerful, actually he had far more power, Walpole, than Johnson could only ever dream of.
And that's because, for example, there's no foreign secretary back in Walpole's day, was there? We'll come on to lessons learned, but it seems to me that almost recognising that fact, Number 10 now tries to run a kind of shadow government within government. They have all these experts across all these policy areas to try and control the system, which they just can't do because they're not big enough.
Absolutely. And the biggest thing, Chris, is that the Walpole, all the prime ministers, all the way down to the Tory Prime Minister Robert Peel, were also chancellors of the Exchequer,
yes,
as well as leader of the House of Commons, and they oversaw the Treasury. So enormous extra powers that Boris Johnson could only dream of. And it's been really difficult for the PMs to make their own way, to dominate government and to have the machine, this great ship of state, going in the direction that they want to. They're at the tiller, at the steering wheel, and they turn it and things don't happen. Now, it is significantly because too many of them haven't really known what they wanted to do with power. Neither have they known how to actually steer the ship and make it work for you.
Now, you touched on Margaret Thatcher just in your opening remarks. You said there that she's the most, what was your expression there, influential Prime Minister of the past?
Landmark. I mean,
and that's more than Winston Churchill. That's fascinating.
Well, I think, she's up there with Churchill, and there have only been 9, I think, in the last 300 years who have truly made the weather, truly made history, changed the course of history, giant figures who every prime minister after them has either tried to be like or not like, but none can escape their shadow. We're still living in Thatcher's Britain far more than anyone else's Britain, and there's still vestiges of Clement Attlee's Britain that we're living under, not least with the NHS. I mean, these are giants. Churchill was obviously a giant, and Lloyd George.
But with Churchill, are you saying that he's more of a war leader than a prime minister, i.e. more internationally focused than domestically focused?
I mean, he had luck to become Prime Minister at the right moment. If Lloyd George had died of his plague, the influenza plague, as he very nearly did in September 1918 in Manchester, Churchill might have taken over. Churchill, if he'd taken over in 1918 at the end of the war as a peacetime leader, could well have been disastrous and very divisive. But he was stunning when he took over in May 1940. So the luck to be there at the right time when your particular skill is most at a premium and in demand. Churchill's was winning war. But hey, I don't think that Churchill was bad as a peacetime leader when he came back from 1951 to 55. I wrote my first book about it, Churchill's Indian Summer, 40 years ago, and I tried to argue that actually this guy wasn't foolish and gaga and dribbling and drunk all the time like people thought he was, but actually he was a really significant prime minister after the war as well. But heck, he's remembered overwhelmingly for the Second World War victory and being the spirit of the nation, summing up the nation and at its best.
Who was the greatest then? Come on the spot now, Anthony Seldon. Who was the greatest and the worst PM of the past 55 we've had?
The greatest female prime minister was Margaret Thatcher. There you are. That will come as a significant surprise to listeners once they pick themselves up from the ground, and would say the greatest peacetime prime minister would be, I think, Gladstone, who, by the way, Boris Johnson on the radio series I did picked as his favourite prime minister. But I have huge respect for Pitt the younger, came to power when he was only 24, died at 46, second longest serving prime minister after Walpole. But heck, Churchill at a moment of greatest peril. And I think the worst is really a tragic story of Anthony Eden, who had been foreign secretary throughout the Second World War and before, resigned over appeasement, but just hopeless as PM when he succeeded Churchill in 1955, because he didn't really know about domestic policy, and he'd led the country into a disastrous adventure in the Suez War, and then lied to Parliament, and then denied that he'd lied. So the shame, the ignominy over that, there was no way back for him, as there might be for, I hope will be, for David Cameron and other post-prime ministers.
Now, towards the end of the book, you talk about how the job can be improved. One of the ideas is to formalise the position of Deputy Prime Minister, to which I would say, wouldn't that actually weaken the job of Prime Minister to give yourself a deputy?
Well, I can see that. But so many PMs get sucked into reaction, the next day's headlines, into crisis management, into short-termism, into reaction. They don't have the time to step back, and all former prime ministers will say that lack of time was their biggest single concern. So if you could have a formalised deputy prime minister, that person can take over a lot of the humdrum domestic stuff and freeing up the PM to be a leader, to travel around the nations, the devolved nations of the United Kingdom much more, and to be truly a national figure, and to be a figure more in Parliament too, because they hardly have any time to be in Parliament, or to enjoy themselves, renew themselves.
Yes, I was struck at the height of the COVID crisis last year when Boris Johnson was in hospital, and we would ask in our daily lobby briefings who's in charge, and they would say the PM's in charge. And then Dominic Raab came in as the first Secretary of State, the notional Deputy Prime Minister, and he had to try and run the show for 4 weeks, almost second-guessing what the PM wanted. The PM then came back not very well, arguably too soon, and there was a bit of drift possibly. We'll learn all this further, as I'm sure, when the inquiry starts. But I wonder whether, had we had a Deputy Prime Minister last year, that's why you have one, because they can step in, they know the mind of the PM properly, and can get on with it.
Yup, and it requires the PM to trust them very well, for example, with Heseltine under John Major, or conspicuously with Willie Whitelaw under Thatcher. And Thatcher was a lesser figure when Willie Whitelaw disappeared from the scene in 1988. And she trusted him to get on with those things so she could think the big picture. And that would have certainly helped. Something's going to happen to a prime minister, and we're going to need to have somebody regularised to take over. Another reason of having a deputy PM, and also building up the foreign secretary to again being a really powerful, important position in government, like in the 19th century with Palmerston or Bevin after the Second World War. Giants, and that again would take so much work off the prime minister.
Now, Anthony Seldon, we're talking this week, in the week that another giant of British politics has died, Baroness Williams of Crosby, Shirley Williams, who we all knew from the 80s and 70s as one of the future prime minister at one point. What's your memory of Shirley Williams?
Well, it's quite personal, in fact. So I was very captivated. I loved the First World War, and I wrote a play called Roland and Vera about her mother, Vera Brittain, who was this magical, charismatic, peacemaking figure. And I got to know Shirley over that. So I saw a different side of her, just such a deep figure. We say this, and I think it has to be fair, that politicians don't always have the depth, the hinterland inside them, the deep interest in literature and in life that she had. She was a real giantess, and she didn't truly fulfill her potential. She would have made, even though people said she was always late for meetings, I think she would have been a great leader.
Yeah, I heard her talk about that disorganisation she felt meant her not suitable for the office, which is classic kind of putting herself down. I'm sure she could have been organised by somebody else to be organised, as it were. But she
was no less disorganised than the current incumbent.
Well, exactly. That's
Boris
what I
Johnson.
meant.
And as I say in the book, Chris, to anyone who writes Boris Johnson off, we only have one landmark prime minister in the last 70 years. Anyone who writes off Boris Johnson is, I think, letting their prejudice take over. Historically, he has been in charge of the country at the time of Brexit and COVID, two massive events in British history, and he won a landslide. So, you don't have to be well organised as PM. You just need to have people around you. You need to be organised well enough, but you don't need to be a supremo with the very tidy mind of Margaret Thatcher.
How will history judge him, do you think?
I think it's too early to say. It's unusual to be this far in, a year and a half into a premiership. We normally know which way the premiership's going to go. I mean, we knew that Thatcher would be extraordinary. We knew that Churchill was going to be extraordinary. We knew that Attlee and Lloyd George were going to be extraordinary Gladstone figures. I think that the margin for Boris Johnson, very significant on the positive side of winning that landslide victory, biggest landslide since Blair, but biggest Tory victory since Thatcher. Extraordinary achievement. And then coping with countries through Brexit, again, second factor, landmark, third landmark factor, getting Brexit done, whatever one thinks about Brexit. It was a historic decision and execution. So the jury's out. If he can stabilise the country, the economy and society, if he can do something for levelling up, and also with COP26, Carrie Symonds very keen by his side on that. Also, they're a very strong double act. I think that he could very easily be one of those figures who people are still in 100 years talking about as a truly historic figure who made the weather. Boris Johnson is a weather maker.
Well, on that note, comments are open on Twitter. Listeners can pass their judgment on whether Boris Johnson will be remembered in 100 years for good or bad reasons. Anthony Seldon, it's been really good to talk to you. We could talk all day, but we can't, sadly. The book's called The Impossible Office, The History of the British Prime Minister, with Jonathan Meakin and Ilias Toms. Once again, Anthony, thank you. We'll put a link to this book in our show notes. All the best.
Thank you very much, Chris.
And I would love to hear your thoughts on some of Anthony's comments about our PM there. You can share your thoughts by emailing us chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk or find us on Twitter. We're at Choppers Podcast. Right, do stay with us. In just one moment, I'll be catching up with Tobias Ellwood MP and Kate Nicholls from UK Hospitality. Talk about whether we should be using vaccine passports to go for a pint. Right after this.
Hi listeners, it's Bryony Gordon here, popping into this podcast to tell you all about another Telegraph series called Bryony Gordon's Mad World. It's a podcast in which I chat to household names and unsung heroes about their mental health, from Stacey Solomon to therapists and doctors on the front line. We talk about looking after ourselves as we heave ourselves out of lockdown and remind you that it's totally normal to feel weird. Search Mad World wherever you usually download your podcasts.
And we're back. Now, after the sad loss of the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, at the end of last week, MPs in the House of Commons joined those across the nation in paying tribute to his life of service. And talk soon turned about how to commemorate the life of the Queen's consort. One idea came from Craig McKinley, Tory MP for South Thanet.
Obviously, statues are being proposed, but my suggestion, as a permanent working symbol of his life and interest, should be for a new multiple-use ship bearing his name.
Now, Craig is not the only MP calling for a successor to HMY Britannia to be built. Another is Tobias Ellwood, the Tory chairman of the Defence Select Committee. So I called him up and started by asking him whether he thought a new Royal Yacht was a fitting tribute to the Duke of Edinburgh.
Well, my goodness, what a week it has been as we take stock of losing somebody so precious. And we've learned so much about the incredible life of the Duke of Edinburgh. He's touched so many people across the decades. And it's difficult to know how we can pay a fitting tribute to somebody that's been steadfast support, not just to the Queen, but to the nation. And he's been involved in so many charities, over 700, formed the World Wildlife Fund, obviously Duke of Edinburgh, but he also had a strong bond with the armed forces, with all three armed forces, not least because of his own service as well. And he was also keen to represent Britain, to promote our place on the global stage. And if there's one thing that we've been good at in the past, it's soft power. It's our ability to engage with other countries across the world, not least with the Commonwealth. And as the recent integrated review, this big study by the government showed, the world's getting more dangerous. It's getting more complex. And not least, we have this massive challenge of influence, authoritarian influence by, China and Russia and so forth. It's so important to keep our friends ever closer and to develop new bonds. And a very good way of doing that, I believe, would be the return of the Britannia as a statement, an iconic statement of soft power to promote global Britain, and I think a fitting tribute to Prince Philip.
There's been lots of pushback on Twitter from people who maybe don't understand it or haven't read beyond the headline. The idea that MPs and yourself are supporting is not to be a pleasure palace, is it? It's more of an actual operational vessel to promote the UK around the world, as well as maybe other roles too.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Indeed, every aspect of our armed forces can't just sit there waiting for war as such. They have to be on constant vigilance, strengthening bonds across the world, preventing war and promoting prosperity, promoting trade, strengthening our bonds. And that's exactly what such a ship could do. But it could also have other versatilities as well. Different programs such as humanitarian aid, it can be used from that perspective too. Vaccination rollouts, for example, it could work with COVAX in order to support tackling this pandemic. So when required, in the same way that the Queen Elizabeth, the actual cruiser, was used in the Falklands, there could be all sorts of uses placed to such a ship here. But primarily, it would be a grand statement of intent, a genuine platform of which to promote global Britain.
But of course, some of the people have been saying that the £190 million cost of it is something which I generated the weekend, because the previous model was £100 million in 1997. That was the replacement cost, and that would be £190 million now. In terms of priorities, which is the world you work in politics, can you make that argument?
I think you can. Take a step back and to say, where is the real challenge here? We're aware that China is growing militarily, economically, technologically. It's going to outgrow the United States. But I don't believe we're going to see a clash of war, of conflict in that sense. This next Cold War, as it comes about, will be much, much more subtle than that. It'll be about us losing our favoured nation status with many of those very countries that the Queen and Prince Philip visited during their lifetimes, because they get into One Belt, One Road programs that they can ill afford. Kenya, for example, Uganda, Sri Lanka, these are countries that are now signing up to deals with China to the prosperity deficit of Britain. And we need to be able to get ourselves out there. We need to be able to promote our military strengths, our bonds, our relationships there, our aid and governance programs as well. And then that's almost like a pincer movement, which then improves trade. And that's where the cost of this, as you've tallied up yourself, would easily pay for itself in benefiting, having a bilateral benefit for the nations that we want to work with and strengthen.
You mentioned China there, and that's fascinating because one of your ideas, and you're a great outside-the-box thinker, I think, certainly when you're in government and now as well as a senior Tory MP. Well, you tell me more about this idea, but an area of Svalbard off Norway became available to buy, didn't it, a couple of years ago? And you looked at trying to buy it for the government.
I did indeed. And there was a bit of pushback for different reasons. We were going through a period of austerity. And much as there was a lot of empathy for the idea, and indeed, practically, it made common sense. Unfortunately, it wasn't seen as a wise use of taxpayers' money at that time. But if anybody thought, going back to Gibraltar, as to whether that was wise investment, or indeed the Falklands as well, to make sure that we look after Ascension Island, I don't think the United States is regretting its Louisiana purchase or even buying Alaska. Land for sale doesn't come up very often. And strategically, this area of the world, the North Atlantic as such, as sea levels or the ice caps absolutely melt, this is going to become a busy thoroughfare. And for us to have a base there, not just from a military purposes, but from the agencies, intelligence gathering, but there's also a space dimension here too, because of course the turning of the Earth means that you can pick up your satellite communications not once every revolution, but almost constantly. And that means we can have a better satellite picture of what's going on across the world, indeed sell that data as well. From many aspects, it made sense to actually take on this purchase. And more to the point, I stress this, if China gets hold of this bit of land, we've seen what they do to some of their bits of real estate in the South China Sea. They don't hang about. They turn them into massive military bases. And like I said, we've touched on it already. There is a growing concern geopolitically about where China is taking the world. I believe we're heading towards a bipolar world if we're not careful.
Has the idea gone away, or is the land still for sale? I couldn't find evidence that it had actually been sold when I wrote this piece for the Sunday Telegraph 8 days ago.
It hasn't, and I have to say, thanks to the Telegraph putting it on its front page, I will be looking at this further to see what can be done, because if we can get enough energy here, and if the sale is still available, then I absolutely believe that it's something that Britain should continue to pursue.
So just you and me talking here, but is the government now looking at it, Tobias Ellwood?
It is something I hope that I can persuade them to do so, yes.
Well, there we are. We changed the world at the Telegraph. Now, we'll put a link into the show notes for this episode so readers can read more about the possible purchase of Svalbard. And just finally, Tobias Ellwood, and apologies for pulling you across the Westminster waterfront, but you are involved in so many different areas. You support the idea of the introduction of vaccine passports, don't you? But you don't want them on a domestic level. Is that right?
No, I mean, internationally, it makes sense. We are custodians of the British Isles. We need to make sure we look after our own. And what an amazing job that's been done in rolling out our vaccines, thanks to our life sciences in creating the vaccines in the first place, our NHS, our armed forces as well. And then, the numbers of volunteers across the country that's allowed us to really get over half of our population vaccinated when you look on the continent, and they're still at around 15%. And that's allowed us to actually open up, reduce those restrictions, as we've appreciated yesterday with pubs finally opening. But the idea that you then have domestic passports, speaking to hospitality operations in Bournemouth and elsewhere, they're concerned that it will be divisive, it'll be discriminatory, it'll be very difficult to actually implement. And my wider concern is less to do with the libertarian aspect of this, but simply that it's been such a dramatic year. The nation's mental health has been tested. Understandably, tempers are beginning to fray. We've seen clashes with police in Nottingham parks and so forth and elsewhere. We are just weeks away from lifting all those restrictions. And I ask, should we now be risking dividing society and stirring tensions when we can remain united and retain national resolve to see this roadmap through to its conclusion without the domestic passport?
Isn't this one of the cases when politicians are slightly out of line with the electorate? Because people understand that in order to be safe, you need to be vaccinated. So some form of proof of that on a domestic level means everyone can have a good time and rip off the masks inside.
You're absolutely right. I think we need to be cautious, though, because already the modelling is suggesting there will be another wave this summer because of the youngsters. It's every time we open up and remove more restrictions and have more connectivity, that allows that pandemic to spread. And the younger generation, I just stress, please get your vaccination when your time comes, because it will help prevent what the modelling is saying, that we're expecting a third wave this summer. But you're right, from a politician's perspective, we shouldn't say no to anything. Pilot schemes are being introduced. Let's see the result of that. And absolutely, I'm willing to be persuaded. I simply share the concerns of any restaurant or pub that will be faced with difficult decisions. Imagine that situation there where they demand to see the vaccine passports, and there's one or two of them that says, well, I've had my checks, but it's at home, or I've had my lateral flow tests and so forth, I'm okay. It makes it very, very difficult indeed. And that itself could rise to division and so forth, which they want to try and avoid. And 21st of June, hopefully all restrictions will be lifted. But happy to be proved wrong and say, yes, we've moved with the times. You touched on it yourself. Perhaps the nation has realized that this is the way to go. If we want to get football matches going, particularly the theatres, I think, where if you have at the moment 1/3 of any theatre audience might be allowed in, that's not enough for them to make money. They need to be able to fill those seats in order to get back to business.
They've got to ask you, are you keeping a diary?
I do keep a diary, but it's more for mine, so I can reflect back on myself. It's been interesting seeing some of those come through. I think some people use them clearly as therapy sessions to get things off their chest. I'm not sure that's the wisdom of why diaries should actually be kept.
Yeah, we're talking about the Alan Duncan diary, aren't they? I mean, he wasn't very nice about you, but I mean, have you sent him a text saying, "Cheers, mate," like I might do if it was me?
No, I didn't. I actually, I try and keep in contact with some of my friends, and I included Alan as one of them. People like Richard Benyon, Nicholas Soames, these characters that Mary McLeod, Seema Kennedy. These are, great friends, and they're missed in the house here. And I did give Alan Duncan a call only a few months ago. How are you doing?
Good for you.
We miss you, I said. Little did I know that he was tip-tapping away on his old laptop. But there we go. That's the way it is, and we move forward. Entertaining diaries, there they are.
Tobias Ellwood, it's been great to have you on. And once again, do come on again. And all the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, we touched on the idea of vaccine passports to pop to the pub with Tobias Ellwood there. And I want to stick with that theme because, well, in England, nature is healing. We're getting back to normal, like it should be. Outdoor hospitality is back. Shops are open, and most importantly, for many of us that are looking a little bedraggled, hairdressers opened their doors. But are those in the industry celebrating as much as us punters? Or are they more cautious about what it all means for their future? I thought I'd ask the person in the know, Kate Nicholls, Chief Executive of industry trade body UK Hospitality. And I started by asking her the most important question. Kate Nicholls, the Chief Executive of UK Hospitality, welcome to the podcast. Did you have a pint last night?
I did go out and have a nice glass of gin and tonic in my local pub in the beer garden. My husband had a pint, but I opted for an expertly served G&T.
And how did you find it?
It was brilliant. After a long period of time where we weren't able to go out and have a meal cooked for us, drinks served for us, it was just so nice to be back socialising with family and friends in a safe environment, having somebody else do the cooking and the washing up. It was brilliant.
So, Kate, you saw firsthand how hard it is for your members to open in these social distancing times.
Absolutely. So our local pub is a brilliant pub, but it would normally have a very full, busy beer garden. Clearly, with social distancing in place, they could only take a small number of guests seated at tables, one-way systems, hand sanitizers, all of those measures. And even though they had a busy trading period, they were telling me that they're probably only going to take 20% of their normal revenue levels just from the outside areas. So a hugely important psychological opening, but not an economic one.
And that's why, of course, a lot of your members haven't opened. That's right, isn't it?
That's absolutely correct. So about 2 in 5 premises across the UK does have an outside area. Some of them are very small, so clearly that's not worthwhile. But for many of the others, the location that they're in, the fact that they don't have a large amount of footfall means it's just too challenging to take a risk. And so we estimate that of those that could have opened, you probably only have a third of the businesses that have started to trade yesterday. Some will reopen later in the month, but obviously the other added factor that you've got to contend with, which we didn't have last summer, is the Great British weather. And for many of our members, they woke up to frost and snow yesterday, which clearly does dampen down enthusiasm for sitting outside with a drink or a meal.
Are you keen to bring forward any of the dates in the plan? I mean, given how low infection rates are in some parts of the country, wouldn't it be wiser to have a kind of regional opening strategy of pubs so you can get more of them open sooner? Or can they not get it organised in time?
Well, I think it would be quite challenging now to bring forward dates. We do need about 3 weeks' notice for people to start brewing the beer, to gear up the supply chain, to get the food supplies in. What we do want to do, however, is to make sure that the government does stick to that roadmap. It should be possible now to give our businesses the notice that the 17th of May is confirmed, rather than leaving it a full 4 weeks before they do that. And most importantly, all of our businesses, when they reopen 17th of May, will still not be able to break even because of social distancing restrictions. So the critical date for us is the 21st of June. We need the government to stick to that date in their roadmap, lift, as promised, all the legal restrictions on social distancing and social contact. That will allow our businesses to break even and start to get on the road to recovery. So I think rather than urging the government to move faster at the early stages, we want them to commit now and do what they promised and lift those restrictions. Then we can get back towards normality.
And what's your view on these idea of COVID passports to get into hospitality venues?
Well, we just think it's not necessary or appropriate for it to be used in a high street hospitality setting where people often will just pop out to the pub while they're out shopping, when they meet a friend, to pop to a coffee shop, to pop for a meal. You just don't need to have that in place. We can understand how vaccine certificates or COVID status certificates could be useful in getting Wembley from 10,000 to 70,000, or for unlocking international travel. But really, for high street venues, it's the safety procedures that we've got in place, and then it's the low cases and the high uptake of vaccine alone should be enough to give us the confidence to be able to unlock hospitality, lift those social distancing restrictions on the 21st of June without the need for passports or papers for pints. And there's a significant cost for these businesses if they do have to use COVID status certification. Our members are telling us they would need to employ 2 extra people to manage that process. They would take a big hit on revenues, and the costs would mean that they would lose 25% of their profits. So we need the government just to be brave, be bold, and stick to that plan.
So those extra staffing were on the door, wouldn't they? Just checking the place is COVID secure all the time, and that's an extra a real drag on the bottom line for the pubs.
Absolutely. These are members of staff that would have to be employed in addition. Most premises don't have door supervisors or door staff on at any time, so only about 20% of the estate will have door supervisors sometimes, but usually they're only at the busy trading periods at the evening and late at night. So actually this would be a significant additional cost, because if we're going to use COVID status certification, then it would mean you'd have to check everybody's papers on the door, and you'd have to refuse entry to people who either wouldn't or couldn't prove that they were green. Now, that causes an awful lot of friction at the door. We know that this is a highly polarised debate, so we know we run the risk of alienating a significant minority of our customer base.
Have you offered your thoughts about this review on social distancing as well, which of course is a major problem in pubs and restaurants?
Yes, we have been submitting to all the review processes that are going through. So we will be making sure we feed our members' views and concerns in, and make clear that any element of social distancing comes at a significant cost for our members' businesses, which rely upon a high volume of low margin transactions throughout the day to be able to break even. And simply, businesses are not viable unless they can break even. So, the big controls that we've got in place that stop businesses making a profit at the moment are table service mandatory, no standing at the bar, capacity caps at 60%. The 1 metre rule, we have 1 metre plus. The businesses have already invested to do that. So actually, it's some of those other measures that would have the biggest impact. But we know all of those measures together are meaning that you've reduced revenues by 30 to 40%. So you would incrementally increase the ability to get towards that 70% break-even point, the more you were able to remove those social distancing controls all the way through. But it's the capacity cap, the 60% capacity, which hits everybody. It hits hotels, holiday parks, self-catering accommodation, as well as pubs, bars, restaurants and coffee shops.
Have you looked, Kate, at the impact of COVID on the sector and just how many pubs and bars just will not reopen?
Yes, it's had a devastating impact on the sector. The revenue levels of the sector are just a third of the size that they were going into the pandemic. So going into the pandemic, £130 billion turnover, 3.2 million people directly employed, another 1.5 in the supply chain, and we had about 110,000 premises. Our revenues are down by almost £80 billion. That's how much we've had wiped off our balance sheets. We sadly lost 660,000 from the headcount. Furlough protected a lot, but we weren't able to furlough everybody, and sadly redundancies are coming through. And more importantly, 12,000 premises closed for good. Almost 1 in 5 of our restaurants, 1 in 10 of our guest houses and hotels, and 7% of contraction in the pub market. So real impact on community assets, community restaurants and pubs, as well as jobs and livelihoods for many small business people.
That's a grim time, and this won't get any easier then, will it?
No, I think that this is a long road to recovery for hospitality. Those businesses that have survived are going to be coming out of this so heavily in debt. In particular, the sector is carrying £2 billion of rent debt, which falls due on the 1st of July, £6 billion of government debt in the form of loans, again, which are starting to be repaid imminently. So there's no breathing space when they can get back to earning profitably and getting above break even. So it's going to take 12 to 18 months for the sector to get back to pre-pandemic levels of revenue and crucially profitability.
Well, Kate Nicholls, best of luck with the sector. It's going to be difficult, but we'd encourage all readers and listeners to do their best to support their local pubs and bars. They need the support right now. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, that's all from us this week. Thank you to my guests, Sir Anthony Seldon, Tobias Ellwood, and Kate Nicholls. Thank you to my producers, Louisa Wells, Elliot Lampitt, and Theo Luludis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. If you'd like to support the podcast and, of course, the Telegraph's brilliant journalism, why not become a subscriber? If you're not one already, please go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper and get your first month's subscription completely free of charge. And if you're so inclined, please do leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other people find this show. And of course, please do buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph if you can. Until next time though, cheerio!